let's find some great historical fiction novels for you to read. Now, I'm calling these forgotten historical fiction novels not because they're actually forgotten, but just because the pace of booktube and really all information in this world that we live in, it just flows so fast that sometimes we forget about books that were hyped maybe even a year ago. And some of these books are way older than that. So they're still great books that I'm sure you're going to recognize. So I'm not really telling you about them other than the fact that I'm reminding you of them. I'm reminding you to pick them up. Oh, and before I continue, let me just say I have not read any of these books. These are all from my TBR. These are all books that either I've rediscovered through booktube or from comments on this channel. You know, people always say, you should read this, you should read this. So let's start with Cold Mountain by Charles Fraser. So this was an international bestseller. I believe it spent 61 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It got made into a movie. It is a book that I've never read, but I've seen so many people say that they absolutely love this book. It is essentially, it's a Civil War novel, so historical fiction novel about the Civil War, about a soldier who is returning home. It is a perilous journey home to the woman he loves. So again, just a great historical fiction book that maybe you forgot about if you've never read it before. I know I certainly forgot about it. Next up is I Must Betray You by Ruta Septis. So I feel like this book, it got a lot of hype, a few years ago. I haven't seen many people talking about it recently. That's why I wanted to remind you of it again. I haven't read it. I have read Between Shades of Grey, but this is a story about communist Romania in the 1980s, and somebody who is basically blackmailed into becoming an informer, but it goes beyond that. I believe he becomes part of the resistance. So it's about that country's particular struggle with communism as well as, the bonds of family and betrayal. Next up is the Welsh Prince Trilogy. Now this is one that people comment on this YouTube channel about all the time. I feel like this book is one of those modern classics that if you have read it, you feel like it's one of your favorite books that you've ever read, but just because of the way that information moves so quickly these days, people just forget about it, right? I mean, there's just so much flashing in your face that you don't even know what to focus on. This is about 13th century Wales, about the Welsh prince who secures a sort of tenuous alliance with King John, the evil King John of England, because he marries King John's illegitimate daughter. And I believe what happens is the daughter, she ends up falling in love with the Welsh prince, but at the same time, she sort of still has ties to her father. So ultimately, it's just a story about Wales during this time, as well as, the ties of family, the ties of love. But again, it's one that I get comments on all the time. People say, you gotta read it. So I'm reminding you of it right now. Next up is The English Patient. So similar to Cold Mountain, I feel like it's one of those books that, got so much hype whenever it was written. I don't know if it was like 20, 30 years ago that it was written. It became a movie, lots of people loved it, and then we kind of just forgot about it. So it takes place in an abandoned villa at the end of World War II in Italy. So this is the end of the war in Italy. And there is a man who is severely burned, the English patient, and a nurse who's taking care of him. And that's kind of really all I know. Other than that, this book was a sensation when it came out. I've never read it. And let me know in the comments below, have you read it? Should I pick it up again? I mean, I'll only get it from the library, so it's not going to really be any skin off my back if I only read 50 pages and I don't like it. But it's one that I definitely really like to try and I'd really like to pick up. Next up is Smilla's Sense of Snow by Peter Hoag. So similar to these other books, it was kind of a smash hit when it came out. And I don't know if necessarily this is historical fiction per se, more like crime fiction. Supposedly it keeps you guessing up until the very end, but it's essentially about a woman who kind of just has the sense that a boy who died in a tragic accident, it actually wasn't an accident, that it was murder. So again, this is another one that was a sensation when it came out. I don't really see anyone talking about it, these days, so I just wanted to remind you guys that maybe this could be the right book for you right now. Now this next one I actually have, it's Waiting by Ha Jen. It's a story about a Chinese doctor, and he's sort of, in the middle of two different women. So he has the woman that he's married to, it's an unhappy marriage, it's arranged marriage, and then he has the woman that he's in love with. But yes, it was a National Book Award winner when it came out, and could be one that you want to pick up. Next up is Cloudstreet by Tim Winton. So if you are interested in Australia or you're interested in reading more Australian authors, I've often heard this one described as, a great sweeping epic about Australia. It's about Western Australia, and ultimately it's about two families that end up in a house, Cloudstreet, and kind of the stories of what happens between them. But again, it's one of those novels that you kind of hear about it every once in a while. Somebody might mention it as one of their favorite books that they've ever read, and then you just go on forgetting about it because you just heard about the new, Abby Jimenez book that just came out. So I guess that's just the way it goes. This next one is The Alienist by Caleb Carr. So this is a Gilded Age historical fiction novel, but I wouldn't describe it purely as historical fiction. I would also describe it as, almost like a horror novel slash psychological fiction. It's basically about 3 different people who are chasing a serial killer, essentially, that is on the loose in New York in the late 1890s. But I have heard this book described by many people as one of their favorite books of all time, one of their favorite historical fiction books of all time. It sounds dark, so I feel like I've got to be in the right mood to read it, but it also sounds like something that I definitely want to get to eventually. Next up, The Winds of War by Herman Wouk, I think is how you say it, Herman Wouk. Now again, this is one that so many people have commented on this YouTube channel that I should read this book, that it is such a great book. It is a sweeping historical fiction epic about World War II. It's over 900 pages, but many people have commented that it doesn't feel like 900 pages, that it just, sweeps you up into this story of a family, an American family, and their relationship to the war. Last up is Papillon by Henry, and I'm not going to say his last name, a French dude, but this one actually isn't historical fiction. This is actually a biography, so this is a true story, but I've heard it described as basically the Count of Monte Cristo in real life. So this guy was wrongly accused of murder, and then he was sent to a prison in French Guiana, and it's the story of his escape. I know it eventually became a movie, and this is how it's described: as the gripping, shocking, ultimately uplifting odyssey of an innocent man who would not be defeated. It sounds great, and I feel like, again, it's one of those books that it kind of gets lost in the sweep of all the muck that we sift through every day when we're on our phones. Well, there you go. There's some forgotten historical fiction books. I hope you can find a book from here that you might want to pick up next. If you have, let me know in the comments below. And as always, happy reading.